collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
On this week's programme, we talk to theoretical physicist Professor Marc Mezard about artificial intelligence, success, limits, myths and threats.
I think that people should be aware of that, and they should be aware of the risk. I think that there is a risk of misuse, which is really something that everybody should be concerned with. I was talking about face recognition, which can be a misuse.
And what was it like for the people who lived under Ottoman rule in Cyprus? A lecture last week discussed inter- and intra-communal relations.
The discrepancy between contemporary perceptions of intercommunal relations in Ottoman Cyprus and what the historical record shows us.
At the Cyprus Institute last week, there was a lecture entitled Artificial Intelligence, Success, Limits, Myths and Threats. It was given by internationally renowned Professor Marc Mezard, and he joins us now. Artificial intelligence is something we're hearing more and more about because it seems to be in almost every field now. But particularly the myths and the way people seem to fear it. I'm fascinated to know your thoughts on that.
I think it's a very interesting period, a very interesting time. It is true that artificial intelligence has made incredible progress in the last 6 or 7 years. It is spectacular. It is a kind of technological breakthrough, in particular in image analysis, in the analysis of language, in automatic translation, in the ability to detect diseases from radiographies or mammographies, etc. All this is quite spectacular. But you are talking about the threats. I think that people have a wrong idea about the threats. Most people will be worried that artificial intelligence could become a superior intelligence which takes the power, for instance. This is pure science fiction. One has to be aware of the fact that the recent progress in AI is progress which is really technological and only on very specific tasks. It is oriented towards solving a very well-posed problem. You have a picture of a mammography, you have to say yes or no, is it likely that there is breast cancer or not? So this is a well-defined question. It's not at all an intelligent behavior. I would even go as far as saying that all the recent progress in AI has not made a single step towards a more intelligent system. All these are not intelligent systems. They are systems which are able to perform tasks which are automatized, and yes, they can help a lot, or they can be also dangerous.
In what sense can they be dangerous?
They can be dangerous like all technological revolutions. They can be dangerous in the sense that they can be misused. If you have, and we have already, with the big success in image analysis, in face recognition, then the use that you do with that, it depends on what is in what country you live and so on. But you see that immediately it gives you the possibility to monitor a population relatively easily. This is already taking place in some countries.
So a little bit of it boils down to in whose hands lies this technological wizardry, if you like.
Yes, of course. I think it is the same as what happened in previous occurrences of technological breakthroughs. You will have very positive, I would say, application, like the help in diagnosis that I was saying, like personalized medicine.
And that I've just heard this morning, they've found a new antibiotic by analysing data with AI.
That's quite possible. There is a lot of activity in analyzing molecules with AI. It is always an extremely painful and costly process to check new molecules. You have to build them, you have to synthesize them, and you have to check what is their properties. With AI, you can get an idea of what kind of molecule may be active or not. And then, of course, you have to go to real tests. But at least you have a first screening, which is very efficient.
It's a shortcut in a way, isn't it, that it's not taking years any longer of people analysing bit by bit. AI can do it so much faster.
It's an enormous speed up. In some sense, we are all aware that long ago there was an industrial revolution in which was invented the steam engine and then the engine, and all this helped mankind in the sense of getting power, of substituting human force by artificial force at that time. What is taking place now is that we really have more powerful machines that help our brains. They can help the brains in very repetitive tasks, or in searching huge database, finding a tiny piece of information. We do that every day. We have even forgotten that 20 years ago it was not like that. So we see it in our everyday life, and again I think the impact on the society is major one. I was talking about the possible misuse of AI, and I think that there is another aspect that one has to understand, which is that like any big technological revolution, it will also reshape the jobs. I mean, there are many jobs that will probably disappear, other ones which will be created. There is this dynamics, as always when there is a new invention, a dynamics on the job market. And this is something that one has to keep in mind.
And that's the thing I think a lot of people latch onto, isn't it? That we'll be out of a job, a robot will take over. But that is actually, if it happens, going to change the way we live, because we'll do other things or maybe have more leisure time.
This is a concern that happens each time there is a new technology. I mean, it's not new from this point of view. My impression is that in many of these applications, AI is coming as an auxiliary, as a device which helps you.
You'll still need people to sort of run it, won't you?
You will need people to run it. You will need people to decipher it also. Take personalized diagnosis, let's say, much more. So you can certainly be helped by a good AI system in order to analyze the situation of a person and say it's likely that you have this or that disease. But of course this will be read, analyzed and discussed with a medical doctor, who is the only person who can take the responsibility for this, and who also is a human being with whom we can interact. And that is absolutely crucial.
Now, one of the things you were discussing was the limits. Do we really know what the limits are? Because the limits are pushed back every time there's a new discovery or a new invention, and I suppose in 20 years' time we'll be looking back and saying, why did we think it would stop there?
It's very hard to guess what are the limits. But what we know is that the evolution of this branch of science, like many other branches of science, it went through steps of a very big enthusiasm and then long periods where it was stagnation. I mean, AI was, the word AI was coined 70 years ago. And
what did it mean back then? I mean, what were people using the label for?
At that time, people were saying we will have intelligent machines. And intelligence, it was not exactly clear what it would be. But I remember that even with the new AI devices that we are using now, which are these artificial neural networks, these were already put forward around 1957. And there was even an article in the New York Times, so you see it was considered important. And this article was saying it will revolutionize the computer and the way of thinking and so on. And then people discovered after a few years that this invention of the 1957, it was extremely limited, and there were many tasks that it was not able to do. And so for several decades, the whole field was kind of silent. I mean, there were a few people trying to do things, and so what took place is this new revolution of 2012, more or less, where there were new architectures and exploiting a lot the big increase in computer power that allowed to really make a breakthrough. So we are at this moment, which is a moment of expansion, but we might well enter in another phase in which it will be more quiet for a few decades. That's quite possible.
And, of course, it's silly to ask in a way, but your thoughts about the future and the uses this can be put to?
I think that one should, and this is why also I'm giving these lectures to explain people what are the basics of this AI. What do they rely on? It's not that difficult to understand, actually, when one takes the time to explain it. I think it's very important that citizens know all that, and that they are aware of what is AI, how it is trained. There's this idea of training from data. This is called machine learning. The machine is not programmed to do something, but it is trained on examples, and it builds its own program itself. So all these
Well, we've already got that. I mean, you get a car that's got a seat with a memory in it for different drivers, things like that. They're already in our everyday lives.
This would be that's a nice example. This would be an extremely simplified example. I mean,
yeah, but it's one that we can grasp if we're not into this science.
Yes, in some sense, your seat in the car. It has 2 buttons that you can switch in order to raise the seat, put it back, and so on. 2 or 3, maybe, in a very sophisticated car. You have to imagine that these AI machines that we are working with, they have 1 million such buttons. So it's a completely different scale. But the principle, you're right, the principle is this one. So I think that people should be aware of that, and they should be aware of the risk. I think that there is the risk of misuse, which is really something that everybody should be concerned with. I was talking about face recognition, which can be a misuse.
And that's
robots,
spreading fast, isn't it, in some countries?
And that's spreading fast. I mean, some countries have used it already substantially, and then China has such a device. Other countries have bought it already. So it's really something that can change, it can change in some sense the efficacy of police forces for repression, for control of the population. Another application that could go very wrong is, of course, autonomous decision-making robots for killing people, killer robots, let's say. That's something also which is a big concern. So I think there are many issues like that. And then there are some more everyday life issues which are also present, like we train these machines from database. And in general, with this training, all the defects of the database will appear in the machine itself. And so we have to be extremely aware of that. I mean, there were some examples of database which were not proper. For instance, for hiring people, profiling people for hiring them in companies. You have now some AI devices which do some screening of the CVs, and they will select some curricula saying this is the person that you should interview and this other one. Turns out that if you have biases in the database that you use to train this AI device, then the biases come out. For this happened in the US with some company which has done that, and never there was a black woman who was selected for the interview. And then they realized that in the training in the database they didn't have black women. So all these are very specific issues, but I think that
we need to be aware of them.
We need to be aware of it, and with the importance that is being taken by AI in our world, we certainly need to have the proper regulation instances. We have to have some regulation boards, some international agreements. I mean, the same way that we have international agreements for not using chemical weapons, then we should also ban the killing robots that are able of autonomous decision-making.
So there needs to be basically an ethical committee.
Absolutely. There need to be many ethical committees on several issues. Certainly there are some international issues. There are some which can be handled at the level of a country. There are some which must be handled at the level of a company, which starts to make use of AI. I was telling you about hiring system, for instance. I think this development of this new technology, and all the more since it is addressing let's say, not intelligence, but task that we do with our brain, and that can have a big impact, we need to set up the proper ethical committees where it is being used.
Fascinating stuff, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it. That was Professor Marc Mezard, who is the director of the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and was in Cyprus last week to give a lecture on artificial intelligence, success, limits, myths and threats at the Cyprus Institute.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
Last week at the CVAR in Old Nicosia, my next guest, who's a teaching fellow at the Pantheon University in Athens, gave a talk on inter- and intra-communal relations in Ottoman Cyprus. He is Andonis Hadjikyriakou. Andonis, I always understood that actually the intercommunal relations between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots were quite good during Ottoman times. Am I misinformed, or have I got it right?
I would say that the historical record shows a rather more complex reality. And what's interesting about people in Cyprus is that they always think of intercommunal relations as either good or bad, either antagonistic or peaceful. And it's always within this binary of either black or white. And what I've realized, what I've understood by studying the relations between Christians and Muslims in Ottoman Cyprus is that relations ranged through a very wide spectrum that may have included conflict or cooperation, but there were many other manifestations of everyday human coexistence, such as collaboration, such as mutual dependence, such as solidarity, such as indifference, such as suspicion, such as tension. So it's a pretty wide spectrum of different shades within human relations, but it's never either good or bad.
Maybe we should just ask you, what is the difference between intra-communal and intercommunal?
That was a very conscious choice in the title of the lecture, and what I wanted to highlight is that everyone is talking about intercommunal relations in the sense of relations between, in contemporary times, Greek Cypriots or Turkish Cypriots, and if we're talking about earlier periods, Christians and Muslims. When we focus only on intercommunal relations, that is, relations between communities, we tend to forget that communities are not homogeneous entities, that they have their own internal differentiations and tensions. So, as important as it is to look at intercommunal relations, it is equally important to look at intercommunal relations, the internal relations within communities themselves.
Especially considering there were several different Christian denominations.
and not only different Christian denominations, but also Muslim denominations. So there are Alevi communities, for example, within the Muslims in Ottoman Cyprus that did not necessarily adhere to the Sunni Islam orthodoxy. So that's exactly what I mean by this collateral damage of assuming that the community is one united entity.
How do you unpick those relationships? Because things like business presumably transcended whatever religion you were, because if you were doing business, you were doing business, and I don't suppose that business people said he's a Muslim or he's a Christian. If they knew they could make money, they would cooperate.
That's precisely one of the best areas where we can see all these different kinds of intercommunal relations concerns business transactions. And again, they're not necessarily peaceful or happy, because when money is involved, both sides may be happy, but money is also a source of tension. And again, the other important thing is that different kinds of oppositional forms of relationships may coexist. So we may have collaboration for a particular business venture, and then we may have a disagreement, and then we have an agreement again. So we have the same kinds of people having very different kinds of interactions at different points in time.
And it's perception as well, isn't it? Because if we extrapolate it to modern day, you do get people who don't agree with, for example, trading across the Green Line, saying, I'm not going to deal with that company because they're bringing Turkish Cypriot things, or vice versa. So there are other things to take into consideration that involve maybe political views?
Political views, ideological views. As you said, material profit may be a motive behind a historical agent's decision, but it may not be the sole source of motivation.
And it might be counterproductive.
Depends on how you look at it. Someone's moral standing may be more important than the immediate profit. So if we have a situation, consider 1955 and the passive resistance campaign, or in the 1960s, after 1963, from Turk to Turk campaign within the Turkish Cypriots, of course there was loss of material profit for business people who did not deal with the other side, but preserving their moral standing within the community was equally important for them.
So there's two things to me that spring to mind, and one is the fact that I do think, generally speaking, life was peaceful here under Ottoman rule, was it not?
If we were to generalize, I would say that...
life went on. There was no huge conflict between the communities. There could have been disagreements, but the history seems to say that the two communities, or whether you call it the two religions, lived side by side and did cooperate.
In the large schemes of things, yes, to cut a long story short. But I would need to qualify this by saying that 1821, for example, was one major exception and one major source of tension that continued subsequently. And in most cases, the sources of tension or antagonism were less confessional, religious, or ideological, and more social and economic. And again, this is why I emphasize looking at intra-communal relations, because there we can see what the sources of tension or cooperation are within the community, and suddenly we see people from both communities doing the same things with people from the other community against their members of their own community.
Taxes and all of that sort
Taxes,
of thing.
Economic transactions, or various forms of oppression or injustice, or accusing someone, rebelling, or indeed extracting profit.
What can you take from your studies of those years? And then, of course, in between we had the British, and we haven't got time to talk about that, unfortunately. about how that affects possibly people's views today. Does it depend on how well they understand the history, or is it rather irrelevant because they just look at things as they are today without being aware of how things were in the past?
Well, I think you've hit the nail in the head, and this was one of the main sources of motivation behind the idea behind this lecture, and that was the discrepancy between contemporary perceptions of intercommunal relations in Ottoman Cyprus and what the historical record shows us. To put it shortly, there are two kinds of people in Cyprus. Those who think that during Ottoman times, or during British times for that matter, or before the 1950s, let's say, life in Cyprus was peaceful, and those who think that life in Cyprus was antagonistic. What I am trying to say is that it was neither and it was both.
So it is never clear-cut.
It is never clear-cut. If we want to generalize, we can say, yes, there were no major conflicts, there were no major, again, apart from 1821, in Cyprus, for example, the practices that we know from other parts of the Ottoman Empire were never really enforced. And there was never, I have to say this, again, apart from 1821, there were never any organized state-led campaigns for forced conversion in Cyprus. Any conversion was the result of the choice of people, usually for socio-economic reasons, converting to Islam.
But can I just interrupt there? That is very important, isn't it? Because there is, again today, this perception that one or both sides are trying to force the other to accept the other's doctrine. And that did not happen in Ottoman times. As far as I'm aware from all I've read, there was total freedom to practice your religion. Now, you might have wanted to change it if your business partner was of the other side, because that made life maybe easier for you, but there was nobody up there on top telling you that you were going to be penalised for being a Christian, for example.
Yes and no. Largely yes, but I have to qualify this and say there was no total freedom. There were certain important limitations in terms of how you exercised your religion. Legally speaking, a non-Muslim was an inferior subject. So, for example, at a court of law, their testimony would carry less weight. They would pay more taxes, so on and so forth. So there were clear boundaries and there were clear hierarchies.
But it didn't stop me going to church.
Precisely. It was nothing, nowhere near the kinds of religious oppression that occurred in Europe at the time. We don't have anything like the Spanish Inquisition. We don't have anything like the wars of religion.
The Huguenots in France,
the Huguenots in France, or the Protestants and the Catholics, so on and so forth. We don't have these kinds of phenomena in Cyprus. So while I don't want to paint an overly idealized, rosy picture of a cosmopolitan society where everyone lived peacefully side by side, I have to acknowledge the fact that contemporary perceptions of eternal hatred and tension and antagonism are not validated by the historical record.
And that is Antonis Hadjikyriakou, a teaching fellow at the Pantheon University in Athens, who gave a talk last week at the CVAR on inter- and intracommunal relations in Ottoman Cyprus. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.